I think that almost all of us eat a more varied diet now than we did 10 or 15 years ago. Simply because we have access to much more information. And this is a sort of a great equalizing factor. But on the other hand, if you take all of food culture and bunch it together, which I haven't done, so this is me sort of theoretizing, but I suspect if you were to do that, we would also have a smaller, less diverse food culture than we've ever had, for the same reasons that I had said before, with lack of information leading to more individual expressions. So the individual has more to play with now, but humanity as a whole has a less diverse food culture than ever before, and I think that's going to continue going in that direction, simply.
Magnus, I'm curious, how do you, Magnus Nilsson, influence Scandinavia's branding scheme to beat France and convince them?
Well, I've written this book, that's now being toured across the world. No, I think that it's actually, there are factors around this that will be very, very hard to do anything about, and that maybe we shouldn't do anything about. But it's exactly the same with both the Nordic home cooking culture and the baking culture, that one of the reasons why people know so little about it is that there is so little information. And as I said before, it's not so easy to find it online, for example, because it's obscured by information that's not relevant. But it's also really difficult if you go there. If you go to, let's say, Sweden as a tourist, you don't get access to Swedish food culture, because there are no restaurants that produce like a truly authentic Swedish everyday meal. There are restaurants that cook Swedish dishes, but they're like a restaurantified version of Swedish dishes. And I think that's a really big difference between like the Nordic baking and food culture as opposed to, for example, the French or the Spanish or the Italian, where it's fairly easy to go there as a tourist, find a restaurant that gives perhaps a somewhat restaurantified version, but still a very representative version of a local everyday meal. And it just has to do with us producing most of our food in the home rather than in restaurants. And that is like, you can't get past that because it's the way the culture looks like, but it's also a limiting factor in how how successful my branding scheme is going to be.
Yes, I have a question about the access to ingredients that come from outside the Nordic region. How have you seen how that's evolved over the years? Not just recently with more globalization, but hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, so people have always traded, and we today tend to think that we are like the first couple of generations who really travel and trade, which is obviously not true at all. We have to do a little bit more and a little bit faster than people used to do. And that's something that you can really see in, most of the countries actually, if you look back, and in sort of specifically in Sweden, if I take that as an example because it's a very easy one. Sweden had quite a large East Indian company that went and traded with Southeast Asia, India, and so on. They brought back a lot of sweet spices, and they are the reason to those sweet spices being such a big part of Swedish cooking culture. They are the reason to Sweden being the biggest consumer of cardamom per capita in the world. 3 times as much as India, actually. It's all about the buns, And another example of that I find very fascinating is sugar. Because you can imagine that before the Industrial Revolution, the most readily available sugar in most of the Nordics would probably have been honey. And honey, is not particularly easy to get by. It was even harder then because that was before the invention of the more rational beehives that we have today. So that wasn't something that you would bake with. And then there would have been a little bit of imported cane sugar, let's say during the 19th century. And that would have been very expensive. It would have been something that you would find in the kitchens of royalty and very wealthy homes. And it wouldn't really have been used to bake with either because you didn't have enough. That would probably have been used much more to sweet and savory food, because that was a very good way of showing off that you had enough money so that you could sweeten your beef stew. You know? And then, with us starting to grow sugar beets and starting to process our own sugar in Scandinavia, this all changed, and sugar became gradually cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and more readily available for a bigger group of consumers. And this is when we've seen like an explosion in sweet baking. Because before like beet sugar, there was not much sweet baking going on in the Nordics. So a lot of these things that we feel are like, if you call them authentically traditional, whatever that is, but a lot of the things that we feel are like really emblematic for our baking culture, things that most people think are very, very old, like let's say the buns. I mean, they're not more than 100 and something years old, 120, 130 years old. That's not much in a historical perspective. And you can even see this, like the cheapening of sugar and the use of it in food. You can look at savory items like gravlax, for example, cured salmon. I mean, the earliest printed examples of recipes for cured salmon, which are like 150 to 170 years old, they have no sugar in them. It's just salt. And then a little bit of sugar has been introduced, and gradually it's increased. And around the 40s, it was half sugar and half salt. And today, it's 2/3 sugar and 1/3 salt. That's the standard recipe for cured salmon. And that's like, it really follows the price curve of sugar, you know, which is interesting. Anyone else?
What are some of the most interesting ingredients that you encountered in your research that we might not be familiar with?
I think that, I mean, for the Nordic cookbook, there was a lot of very sort of, to me, unfamiliar and exotic ingredients that wasn't part of my growing up in Sweden at all, like, you know, various riddles and puffins and all kinds of, you know, things that wasn't served in my school when I grew up. But for the baking book, there's been much less of that. And what's been like the greatest sort of discoveries for me is partly, like in a broader sense, the diversity that, I mean, I didn't quite know that it was going to be that much and that it was going to be so different from region to region. And then the other thing is that I discovered like a whole lot of very fascinating and interesting techniques that I had no idea existed. I mean, for example, there is this rye bread that's, so the Nordic region can be subdivided in two cultural regions, one Swedish and one Danish, and that has to do with whom occupied whom and things like that. And the Danes, they had the whole West, and on top of the geographical things that I talked about before that influences what people baked and cooked, there's also like a thin cultural layer, you know, that comes from the Danes. So all of the countries that they occupied, or you know, that still belong to Denmark, like Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. I mean, Iceland is not Danish anymore, but it was occupied for a long time. They will all have their own versions of Danish rye. I mean, and all these three islands, they've never grown any cereal crops, so it's very clear that it comes from there. And on Iceland, I mean, an island that doesn't have many trees at all, the predominant fuel to heat your house with the invention of and popularization of the iron stove would have been peat moss, which is like serious work to dig out from a peat bog and dry coal and all that. And no one would spend like their hard-earned peat moss on heating the oven to bake a bread. But I mean, they have volcanic activity on Iceland. So what they did was that they just found these geothermal areas, dug holes in the ground, one per house in the adjoining village, and you go there in the evening with your bucket with the Danish rye dough bread, you put it in, put the lid on, and you come back in the morning and you pick your bread up. And this is something that's considered very traditional. It's not that old. I mean, it was simply a way of problem solving for, like, you know, when the Danes occupied and they wanted their rye bread, essentially. So it's a few hundred years old, but it's something that's continuously practiced also today on Iceland, and lots of stuff like that.
So between the, oh, I'm sorry. Between Denmark, Sweden, and I guess I would include Norway and Finland, which country has the best baked goods in your opinion?
The best
Baked goods.
I mean, that's a difficult one. So, where is everyone from here? No, so for the book, a big part of the process was to remove my opinions from the content matter to make it as representative as possible for as many people as possible in the region. So you won't find in the recipe composition any bias from my side, but I've also written a lot of narrative text for this book, and obviously there will be some more opinions, and personally I obviously have a lot of opinions on this. Personally, I think that Finland has an absolutely fantastic and unique baking culture that, I mean, it's definitely connected to Scandinavia, but there is so much more there that you just won't find anywhere else. Any more questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm from Sweden. I think personally one of the most fascinating things within baking, like when it comes to spices, is the use of saffron,
Yeah.
which is nothing that you will grow in Sweden, but has been, I guess, introduced quite late, because it must have been an expensive, spice for to be used historically. Like, at what point was it introduced? Because now it's a really part of actually baking in Sweden, leading up to the Christmas time.
Yeah, I actually don't know exactly when saffron was introduced to Sweden, and I know that it's in the book that I researched, but I don't remember exactly when. I always just remember the cardamom. But it's the same era of time, and it's the same principle that it was brought through trade. But saffron did not come with East Indian companies, so there's a difference there. It came by land from the Middle East and those parts. And it has been in Sweden probably longer than most of these sweet spices that came by sea, but I don't know exactly how long.
What are some of the books or other resources that you use during your research process for this?
I mean, I looked at two things. One, so I can actually explain a bit sort of about the general research process, because it was like a multiple stage. It was like a many-stage rocket, essentially. And it started, the first thing I did was put out a questionnaire on a website, nordiccookbook.com, where people could answer to questions about their own food culture. It was like a multiple choice questionnaire, and then they could also submit recipes. And for that, I learned a few different things. One, that everyone lies about their own food culture. And then I also learned that all of our grandmothers, they also lied. And the first one, it had a lot to do with, for example, I mean, one of the questions was name a common everyday dish from your home region. And a lot of Swedes, they said stekt saltsill, which is, salted pan-fried herring, which is admittedly a very Swedish dish, but I think that I ate it last like 1999 maybe, and I think that most people don't eat that more than once every 5 years perhaps. It's by no means a common everyday dish for the population as a whole. And I think that quite often we tend to, when we talk about our food culture, romanticize quite a bit, and we tend to look a lot more at what used to be than what's actually the case now. And then when it comes to grandmothers, we also got like a lot of herring recipes submitted. And there were 100 and something recipes for like the standard basic pickled herring. And all of these recipes, they came from someone's handwritten recipe book. All of them were cherished family recipes. All of them had been passed down through at least one generation or probably more. And all of them were almost exactly the same. To the point of them having like the exact same number of white peppercorns and things like that. And incidentally, they were also exactly the same as the pickled herring recipe in Bonniers Stora Kokbok, which is like the standard work on Swedish cooking that was first published in the 40s. So all of our grandmothers, Went in there, noted it down, just handed it off to the next generation. Great storytellers. Yeah. Anything more? Yeah.
Hello. I'm wondering about one of the slides that looked like they were branches with something wrapped on them. And I'm wondering what that is.
That's called pinnbröd. And it's like, I translated it to camping bread. And it's essentially something that I used to do when I went to preschool. And you have like an outing, and there is lunch. And you have a stick, and you have a very simple dough that's unleavened. It's just wheat flour, water, and salt. And then you kind of shape that into like a little snail, and you roll it around the stick, and then you grill it. And either you eat it as it is, you can have some butter on it, or if you're very good at detaching it from the stick, you can detach it, and then you can stick a sausage into it. That's what it is.
I'm curious about your questionnaire, about younger people. What did they answer? I met a young man from Sweden not too long ago, and he said he loved to cook, so we were talking food, and I said, so what kind of cooking? And he said, well, I do basically home cooking, Swedish home cooking. And I said, such as what? And he said, spaghetti with meat sauce.
Yeah, I think that's actually a much more accurate example than the salted pan-fried herring. But surprisingly enough, also the young people, they say the same things. You know, they also say kåldolmar as like everyday cooking, which is like one of the most laborious things you can cook. I mean, that was sort of what just made me understand that the questionnaire as such, I mean, just asking people anonymously to talk about food culture doesn't work. So that became more of a roadmap for the further research, and most of the research was actually done out in the field, visiting people at home, making sure that I could spend enough time there so that they could first show the things that they think that you want to see, and then run out of those and start doing what they do all the time, which is the interesting part. That's difficult with the mic.
So I've been to a lot of restaurants, mostly in Stockholm and like New Nordic, and they all serve the same like sourdough bread. And I was just wondering, like, if you know if it's like a tendency, why don't they like explore more like traditional baking techniques to like show the people instead of doing like the one sourdough bread that they do literally in like each New Nordic restaurant? I don't know.
I mean, you're gonna have to ask them. I don't understand it either. I think it's yet very strange. But the thing with the term New Nordic is that, first of all, it's a term that I very rarely use because it's like a catch-all term that's very imprecise. But people do use it about restaurants, and there is a certain something that you can associate with the term New Nordic. And one thing is for sure that it has very, very, very little to do with reflecting the actual Nordic food culture. It's much, much more about emulating a visual style than about actual depth of, you know, cultural conscience and things like that. And I think maybe that just takes a little while, because you have to start somewhere. And if you make a dish that, because I mean, there are, I mean, the ones that people most often refer to when they say New Nordic is probably Noma. Although themselves they refuse to be called New Nordic. But I mean, there's a lot of restaurants that would consider themselves New Nordic, that would make dishes that would look like they came from perhaps Noma or Mayhem or Faviken, but missing out the point, which is like deeper cultural understanding and trying to reflect your place. But as I said, you have to start somewhere, and that's better than nothing. And maybe with a little bit of time, New Nordic just becomes Nordic, and then maybe it becomes Old Nordic. And by that time, perhaps you will have breads that will also reflect our actual food culture. I don't know.
During your book tour, did you get any impressions from grandmothers from Minnesota or North Dakota or Montana about true Nordic cooking?
Going to Minnesota is amazing every time. It's, I I mean, people are so grounded in their Nordic heritage there, not just the Swedes, but to my events, there's mostly the Swedes that come. And there will always be people coming with photos of what they did 30, 40 years ago, wanting to show. There's always people who come with things that they've baked that they want to share, and it's amazing. I mean, so the Swedish American food culture is, by most people practicing it, thought to be Swedish food culture. The fact is that it's its entirely own, completely unique food culture that should be, and it hasn't been done yet, so it's an open playfield for someone who wants, but it should be documented really well, because it tells a story about a very important process in the Nordic countries where people left to move to the US. And there was this funny example with the Nordic cookbook. So Rickard Tellström, who's an ethnologist, and he's helped me to make sure that the books are historically correct. And we traveled quite a bit together. The first time we ever went to Minneapolis, we were shown around town and like all the Swedish food stores, and we met so many third, fourth, fifth, and sixth generation Swedes, and they were all talking. This was before Christmas. They were all talking about this potato sausage. And after a while, I was like beginning to feel that maybe I had missed something in my great opus of Nordic cooking, because I'd never heard about the potato sausage. And then I asked Richard, who knows everything about food culture in Sweden. It's like, have you heard about this potato sausage? He was like, no, I never heard of it. And then when we came home, because we didn't dare tell anyone there, when we came home, we started looking into this, and it turned out that we have a sausage called isterbann in Sweden, which is made with barley in it, and it's a lacto-fermented cold smoked sausage. And in a certain part of Småland, that sausage was traditionally made with potato instead of barley, and almost everyone that lived in that particular part of Småland moved to Minneapolis. So they took the tradition with them. There was no one left to practice it in Sweden, and they cherished it and spread the word about the potato sausage to a whole Swedish community, that this is like one of the important memories from the motherland. And it's been preserved in a bubble, so it exists only there. And I think that's like truly amazing.
Going back to your research, can you talk more about how you decided where specifically, what families to go to, and things of that nature?
Mostly I decided that, I mean, basically the initial research created a roadmap where with certain very iconic or emblematic things that needed to be researched and predominantly needed to be photographed. And that was sort of how I did my travel planning. And then I always made sure to have, so let's say that I was going to go to Iceland and photograph, this very classic horse sausage that they do. Okay, that was the goal of the trip. And then I will always make sure that I have a few more days on site with no planning. And I always travel alone. And it's very fascinating when you travel alone and you are a curious person and you start talking about food. People get very excited and they want to show you what they have. People are very proud of their food culture, generally speaking. So you get invited all kinds of places. I mean, that's how it happens. And I very quickly realized that that's the best way of getting like authentic information, is to just be there, have time, and be ready to engage with people. And then you're just a fly on the wall, photographing, documenting, and getting to know things. And then another thing that's very important for a book like this, and that was more difficult, is to sort of narrow this huge material that I collected down. Because I mean, there were over 10,000 documents in this material with like newspaper clippings and sound recordings and recipes and photos and things like that. And to do that, I had one person in each country who is a very well-grounded expert on the food culture of the area. And I presented them essentially with my list that I thought was going to be there. And then they said that, well, that doesn't need to be part of it because that's not representative enough for enough people, and on the other hand, you've forgotten this and so on. And then the whole material, when it was done, was also checked by Rickard Ledstone, to be honest. Good. Are we done? More questions? Sorry.
Well, first of all, I think that you should share with everybody how you manage time, because you're a very busy guy. You wrote how many pages in 5 years, 3 years or something? How the hell do you do that? And the second part of the question is, what would be your advice to young people who want to enter the business that you did? Because you're very young, you're 34, you're extremely successful. What would you say to them?
I mean, I think that the most important thing when you, the thing with managing time is very difficult. And family. I have 4 kids as well, so it's a lot of that going on. I think that the most important thing for anyone entering the hospitality business is to do it because they really want to, because they're passionate about hospitality, about cooking and serving others. It's the only motivating factor that actually counts. And then the second advice is that when you are in the hospitality business, it's very important already from the beginning. And I mean, it's not too late if someone hasn't been able to, but it's very important, I think, that already from the beginning, you have to work in really good places. And that doesn't mean you have to work at Faviken or Noma. It means that you have to work in places where people care, where they care about what they do, regardless of price points, where there is like actual craftsmanship and actual attention to what's going on and to the customer and so on. And I think that those are the most important things with to remember when you're going into the hospitality industry. And then there's a lot can happen, and I think a lot has to do with who you are as a person and things like that. And I mean, I was and I've been sort of blessed in a way with a very high capacity to work, and I enjoy it. Not all the time, but almost all of the time. And I've also been given the opportunity to work only with things that I find extremely interesting. And that's the reason why I've been able to run Faviken, do these books, raise a family, and all these things at the same time. It's just because it's all been so interesting and fun and nice, And I don't think that would have been possible if that hadn't been the case. Thank you. One last question.
With information as easy as it is to share today, I guess my question is, what do you think that Nordic baking culture can learn from other cultures and vice versa?
I don't actually have an opinion on exactly what we should learn. I just think that we should learn. And I think that we should learn about, I think that everyone should just always be open for whatever experiences that are presented to them. And you judge case by case whether it's something they actually want to know more about. And I think that's one more thing that we've actually been really good at in the Nordic countries. Maybe it has to do with us being small countries, relatively small, relatively isolated, that it's raised a population that's, I think, fairly outward going, which is not always the way that, for example, Swedes look upon themselves. But I lived in France for a few years, and that made me kind of look upon Sweden from the outside, and that's one of the things that I've noticed, that a lot of people living in the Nordics are really curious and like outward people. And that's sort of the only thing I think is important. But now we should sign some books, I think, because otherwise
Thank you.